I guess this is one good thing that has come out of the pandemic is supply chain visibility.
Before we get started with the show, here's a quick word from our sponsor, Global Training Center. As trade compliance professionals, you want to make sure that your procedures and documentation are completed as correctly as possible to avoid any delays and possible fines. We provide a range of trade compliance courses that will fit your needs. From in-person or web training to recorded on-demand courses, we can train one or even thousands on your team through your learning platform or on our portal. We can even customize a private session for your team. Go to globaltrainingcenter.com to find out more.
Hey folks, we're in for another show with Simply Trade Podcast. It has been great. I keep saying this over and over again. Lalo and I are so humbled by your support. We go out and do public appearances, and it has been fantastic. We have first-time listeners, if you will, that are rookies in the industry. And the last conference we went to, GTech up in Chicago, there were two sets of folks, two startup software companies. And both of these young folks, it was two in one company and two in another. And so the four of them, wow, it was just like they came up and said, yeah, we listened to your show. It really educated us, or as I would say, edumacate. And it was great. So with that, we are going to get into a good discussion on a very good friend of the podcast today. Melzie Wilson is joining us.
Yeah, we've known each other a few years.
Just a few, of course, you're still a young buck compared to me. I've been around since dirt, so. But that said, you're also one of those that you're definitely one of the sharpest tools in the shed. So it's like you have such great knowledge and always a pleasure to be around. So welcome to the show, Melzie.
Well, thank you. I'm glad we could finally make this happen with schedules and projects and stuff, just hadn't been able to make it work. So I'm glad we are today.
Well, we're going to wind up just right off the bat, folks. We'll have the contact information for Melzie, and as we're talking through this, if you want to reach out to her, just hit our show notes, and you'll be able to get a hold of her. But that said, Melzie, you're wanting to talk today, I understand, about transportation and some of the challenges thereof of what, managing a contract or getting one or what?
Well, we've seen some changes of late. We never saw any movement with changes, especially in the maritime industry, for many, many years. And now we had the OSRA 22 that came out. And so since then, we've had some additional changes and updates, and it's a constant movement of changes. One of the big things we're seeing is detention and demurrage. And that is a throwback, of course, to the unreal amount of money that was charged by the terminals and the VOCs during COVID and the pandemic. And as I said at GTech, I guess this is one good thing that has come out of the pandemic is supply chain visibility, because I don't know about the two of you, but my whole career has spent telling my family and friends not in the business what I do. And the pandemic highlighted it. So, I ended up being the topic of conversation and engagement at family gatherings.
Oh, like, what do you do? And you get the deer in the headlight looks to all of a sudden we're in the, we're on the front row. Oh, there's spotlight. Here it is.
Exactly. So D&D got on the front row, which I'm glad to see that, because we all felt during this period of time there was unfair charging of D&D. We saw where, I can't turn in one container unless I'm picking up another. But if I don't have another container to pick up, then I was stuck with a container I couldn't turn back into the port.
Okay, so I hate to interrupt you here, but we have a lot of people that are either rookies in the industry, and there's some that are not even in supply chain and whatever, but they enjoy our show. So it's like, okay, I always want to stop. It's like, what do you mean by demurrage or D&D? Can you explain that a little bit?
So detention and demurrage, we were, in fact, part of this was someone was referring to charges as per diem and not detention and demurrage. Detention and demurrage is assessed by a port or carrier when the cargo owner or the ownership, whether it's the NVO or the cargo owner itself, has not picked up the freight. So it usually goes from a terminal, which may or may not be owned by the steamship line themselves, or it goes terminal to the VOC as far as ownership goes, and then to the NVO or directly to the cargo owner. It all depends on how that flow of responsibility goes. So we were seeing during this period of time, and have in the past, where I would get a bill for detention and demurrage, and it could be anywhere from a year to 2 years old. I've actually seen them several years old. So detention and demurrage, in part, not even the aspect of giving some parameters of what can be billed and how it can be billed, but that time frame of 30 days, the clock starts, and I have to be billed either as an NVO, if I'm
Which
the
is
next
a non-vessel
operating common carrier. So I'm a service provider. I'm not an asset owner like a VOC. I'm not saying carrier, because a carrier can be either the VOC, which is a vessel operating common carrier, who is the asset based, and then we have the NVOCC, which is strictly the service provider.
So putting that in perspective, a VOC, vessel operating carrier, would be like a Maersk, CMA, CGM,
MSC,
yeah, any of them. All right. And so meaning that, all right, here comes the vessel. It comes in, you got a container on there. It comes off. It's operated by the VOC, and they're transferring that to their own warehouse. And then from there,
not necessarily, it's coming into the terminal.
It's being handled. It's being moved. And there's only so much that's included in the transportation charges. Then you got the port handling charges that is under the demurrage.
Well, the port handling fee, there could be some port handling fees that could be assessed in the transportation costs, but detention and demurrage is assessed after a free time is given. So it could be my free time is 2 days. It could be that it is 5 days. It could be that, I have a great one and it's over that period of time. But most of us see anywhere from 3 to 5 days.
So what we're leading up to is that, pulling it all together, is that if your freight is having to be handled and moved in whatever, and it's not cleared and all that, or it's cleared, but your truck driver or your rail hasn't been worked out as far as your inland transportation, whatever, all that starts adding up, and that's what it comes under this umbrella. So the point being is, as we're getting into that, the other issue comes into play. It's as an incentive, if you want to minimize your demurrage or these type of D&D type charges, look at making sure that you're doing things right on the front end and get that entry filed early, and making sure the information's right. And even to the point where 5 days out, your entry can be, you could be transmitting the entry, 10 days out, or even file the entry with the ISF entry, at the time, whatever. The point being, the information gets in there, and then you can start finding out if your freight is being flagged for an inspection or entry docs required kind of thing, like more information is needed. All that done before it even arrives, if you are proactive, so that all right, there's a problem. Here's what I get. Okay, fine. If you don't do that, or traditionally freight comes in of the old days, people really don't do this anymore, but as much. and wait till the freight arrives, then have the entry prepared and submitted, and then go through all that, well, that means more handling physically of the freight. You're going to get charged for it, right?
Right. Well, the big exposure there and waiting till the last minute is a delay in the customs clearance, which that would be a mitigating factor. Like in the state of California, if you have a shipment that is held for government purposes, for government clearances, whether it's U.S. Customs or FDA, Food and Drug Administration, or Department of Transportation, whomever it's being held for, then you get like a out of jail free card in getting detention and demurrage. Other ports are not or do not have that type of legislation in place. So that's a really great plus that was adopted years ago, which is very helpful. But there are times when, there's equipment shortages. So you'll get detention and demurrage. Port closures. There's a huge case now with the FMC with Evergreen where the port was closed. Well, they couldn't pick up their freight, but they were still assessed detention and demurrage during that period of time. So we'll see. Everybody's watching that case because if a port closes due to any particular reason, like we were just talking earlier about before everybody got on, about LA and the power issues they're having, that could be the case when it comes to another port. It could be weather. It could be any particular element, and that is a huge plus in mitigating or getting out of that detention and demurrage charge.
Okay. So as we go through and you're working through all of that, your service provider, as you just mentioned, and looking at that, they need to be on your team, if you will, and you need to be on theirs as well, is like working through this to try and, again, be as efficient as possible, because you're going to have those types of charges. The question is, what are things you can do to minimize it? And I guess part of that would be, well, analyze some of your history and what have you gotten charged for, and then look at it. Why? And was there anything within your control to do something? On the other side, like you said, it could be weather. It's out of your control somewhat. So that's another thing to say, you know what? Is this something where, let's say it's a weather situation, whatever. Are you set on a particular port, or should you have multiple port options, or what should you work with your service provider on?
Right. So if let's look at the cargo owner first. As a cargo owner, whether I'm the shipper or the consignee, I should be well aware of my supply chain. I should not be jumping around with multiple service providers. Would I have 2, maybe 3 principal service providers I'm using, whether it's a VOC or whether it's an NVO, to have some options and be able to approach that. But with each service provider, give me some options. Give me an LA, a Long Beach, a Seattle, a Portland, or Canada port of call. Give me some options in order to facilitate the movement of my supply chain, just in case. Because if anything, anyone has figured out in the last few years is that just in case can happen. And if it's a completely new supply chain routing for you, then that could cause different issues. So be well aware and be communicating on a regular basis with your NVO and VOC. I highly recommend, where we're talking about, do a pre-clearance. Make sure your documentation's right. Make sure you're on board with documentation versus a payment, because there are times I've seen where, one or the other is holding documentation to me to do clearance, the finance guy's holding on to the money to the last possible minute. I need those documents as far as the logistics and compliance people in my company. But, if you weigh it all out, go ahead and pay for the goods, get that documentation, and then make sure that you get that paperwork onto the service provider so you don't have any glitches. So if there's any questions, you can get that all cleared up. But make sure that you have an NVO or VOCC, of course. But especially when you're going through NVOs, make sure, especially in a foreign country, make sure that NVO is licensed or registered with the FMC here in the U.S. And it goes with oversight with the FMC because you want that. You also want to make sure that their rules tariff are in place, that their terms and conditions of their bills of lading are in place, and also their bond. If I have an issue and that I can't get any financial restitution out of that NVO, I want to make sure they have a bond so that the FMC can support me in a costly situation of getting some money back. May not be everything, but at least it'll be some help.
So in looking at that, there's a lot there in looking through, trying to get up to speed. What would be a way for someone to become more proficient in this? I'm a rookie in the industry and I need to learn this. You've thrown in a whole lot of stuff in there to say, gee, all I do is arrange a shipment to move from, point A to point B. There's a lot more behind that. Even the scenario of how Incoterms or the appropriate Incoterm that applies into that will determine, who should be billed for transportation, who's going to take care of the duties and taxes from a clearance and who's their broker, who's going to take care of, inland transportation after the port is cleared or whatever, or, you're exporting. Who takes care of the transportation from your dock to the port or wherever it's the carrier and all that. So how, from your perspective, somebody's new in the industry, what could you do as far as advise? How do they become proficient here?
As far as a cargo owner or I'm purchasing whatever my Incoterms are. So what I would do first and foremost is on the ocean, let's take ocean, for example, I would make sure whoever I'm looking at or engaging is licensed or registered with the FMC, first and foremost. Secondary, just because I know the worth of the association, is check, which is free access to anybody, is check and see if they're a member of the NCBFAA. And because that means that one, they're getting some continuing education. They're part of an organization that has great representation with all government, especially with FMC in this case, with an NVO. And get some education yourself. There's consultants out there such as myself that offers training and evaluation of what you want to do versus what you should do and identify your risk. There are podcasts like this. There's great podcasts. There's great YouTube. There are Google, do a search and you can see who's talking about what. I mean, there's some great NVOs out there that are willing to invest in time and educate you on what you should and should not do. We also have, I would look at, it's not just price. Don't always look at the price because the price may bite you. But look at experience, with the company you're dealing with. And you can pretty much tell very quickly if somebody knows what they're talking about or not, if in the process. ICPA is a great learning, GTEC. I mean, there's so many things out, so many opportunities for people, cargo owners or buyers, to connect with some type of organization or body in some capacity to learn what we do.
Well, and to that point, I have to just say, in Lalo's company, Global Training Center is a phenomenal.
I'm sorry. Yeah.
Well, but it's also one that it's we always want to talk about the issues and give you a good subject, but I got to tell you, GTC or Global Training Center is a phenomenal resource. And we're not trying to constantly, shove something down everybody's throat, but folks, I'm telling you, it's, the courses that, Lalo and his wife offer through his company. The NCBFAA goes along lines with certifying all of that and becoming a CCS and CES and all that. Well, there's a lot of courses they offer that take care of that. So, all right. That said, what about like the air cargo side of things and or rail? Which one you want to? I mean, there's both of those have their own challenges. Air cargo is a little bit faster. Of course, express is super fast, but in the mix. But with an air cargo situation, I guess that would be more of you could have a last minute diversion of a flight due to weather or whatever the case may be into a different port. The good thing is that in today's world, an entry submitted, and you don't have to designate the port of clearance. You can say that, here's the bill of lading, and that's how it's all tied together. So the carrier changes it and you don't even know it, but it's like it moves on with the review into the new port based on their manifest by the carrier. So
there's particulars in that. I don't want to make a blanket agreement statement with you because you've got PGAs, you've got customs, you've got PJs. There's a lot of factors that would impact that. But yeah, there's a risk, with any type of, rail in the wintertime, and you're going, from, we're not coming from, directly from Canada straight into Memphis, for example. We're coming across and going through the mountains from Portland, Seattle, to the Midwest. We have problems there with icing and snow and those type of situations, as well as truck. Truck can have its issue. And of course, just about there's a risk with any type of transportation you choose. It's just, in my supply chain, can I afford to do air freight? Do I have that cushion of pricing as a cargo owner or seller? Do I have that cushion to be able to afford to do that?
Well, and your assessment. All right. So here that you're hitting on something that's very interesting is that if I'm a cargo owner, I'm buying, a product, so I'm going to be taking on the cargo. I'm arranging for the transportation of that shipment. And so let's just say that, as far as looking at, if I'm told, okay, move it from point A to point B, we need it in here by air or whatever. It's like, okay, you're just doing it. At the time, as far as a frontline person that may be establishing or setting up that transaction, you know what? They don't normally are looking at the contract prices at that point. They're looking, because that's already been figured for them, so, right. So in the overall scheme of things, as we're looking through, if they're setting those things up at some point, there's got to be a review to say, okay, we're using air cargo and this was done right or it wasn't done right. I mean, let's just say that we're using air cargo, they set it up, but then the carrier or the person I was dealing with, it didn't follow what we expected. We didn't get what our expectation was. How should you, as a company, the end customer, I guess, and manage that kind of process with your carriers?
Well, it's just communication. SOPs. Next time I come on, we're going to talk about standard operating procedures. And that's just not for an asset-based company to a cargo owner, or cargo owner to an asset-based company, or asset to service provider. It's a mutual understanding, and that mutual understanding must be at all levels, not only from the executive level, but it needs to be known by sales, your purchasing department, your logistics team, whomever that case may be. Especially in these larger companies, you need to be meeting internally on a regular basis. The dumping, and I'm not an expert, but on this new latest greatest of that catch-all dumping that's come out, but that's going to be a risk for a lot of companies. And so hopefully those parties that may apply to, they sat down with their logistics people, they sat down with their purchasing people in order to mitigate those responses. And you can look at the different, however it comes in. I mean, one thing that there's no rule of thumb with a supply chain. If another thing the pandemic taught us was the fact that I don't care if it's the same product, same trade lane, if you have 3 companies with the same type of needs, with the same product and pretty much that same approach, they're all going to have different parameters and different. Some of them are going to be, it's got to get on the shelf, while others like, that's too cost prohibitive. Let me talk to my client and see how I mitigate it, because I'm tied into a price. I've got a contract price. And so whatever we pay for is going to have to be eaten. So again, you can't speak rule of thumb. You really have to go supply chain to supply chain and figure out what is their priority. And you need to identify that, because, so-and-so NVO handles a lot of reefer containers out of South America. Guess what? Just because they do a lot of that type business into the U.S. doesn't mean they know your particular needs. Again, that's where that mutual understanding, the communication, don't assume. One thing that this business teaches you and can cost you a lot is don't assume.
Well, and to your point, you were saying you get in and you talk to the purchasing folks, you talk to the transportation, you talk to logistics, or whatever. You're talking to multiple departments. And that's so paramount, and to look at an issue holistically. So, and I think that's phenomenal. If you're a service provider, then in looking at this, is there anything in particular service providers should be doing as far as offering in their services, or do they just get complacent and say, "Well, just here's the fee, and so be it"?
Complacent these days, you're losing. You're losing, just because there's been so many changes, especially in the area of ocean, that you got to be on your game. You got to be well aware of all the factors with the new changes, because just look at the D&D. If I get a VOCC bill and it's late, it's past the 30 days, I didn't do anything to challenge that. And I move on and I bill it to my client. Guess what? My client can turn it down, because that's an invoice that was billed initially after the 30-day period of time. So, or, you can say, well, I gave all the dispatch. Why are you saying, I thought this freight was picked up this, and it was actually the truck driver, the trucking company didn't pick it up, or there was no equipment. So that's where that communication and all comes into play of understanding what's going on. Don't assume.
Mm-hmm. Well, as we are looking at this in the overall, I guess I would ask the question, is there anything, because we're going to need, for sake of time here, we could keep on. For the sake of time.
Yeah, because we're talking about the same thing.
Yeah, I know. Is there anything else you want to go with and make sure we make the point here to our listeners?
Communicate. Whether or not you're the NVO talking to your client, make sure that when you're talking, you have an operator mindset and you know what you're dealing with in the market today, not just from a pricing, but the supply chain, and understand that client's supply chain. I've seen it too many times over the years, heard it too many times over the years, where an executive or a salesperson would come to me and go, "Oh, so-and-so doesn't like their present service provider. We need to quote them and get them business." Go, whoa, what's the problem? What's the problem first? Because we may be having that same issue. And so you're just, this poor guy's thinking he's coming to you and you're the end all do all, but it's a worldwide or industry impact that's going on. So that's what's happening, not just the fact that changing service providers will cure your problem.
Well, and it may be a case where if somebody's all of a sudden having problems and they're happy with it, it may turn out to be where that client from a service provider standpoint is not somebody you want because they're too high maintenance and they're constantly, they don't have their paperwork right or whatever the case is, and then they're beating you up over it. So
that's where an experienced service provider comes into play. Because you can, if you're sitting and you're doing the right thing by sitting down with your client and getting a SOP, let's say I'm doing the MBO and the customs brokerage, that's a huge transition. So, you want to have you want to make sure they have their compliance people at the table, purchasing, logistics, not just the director or VP over that company. You want to make sure you have all the parties sitting at the table so you can go through a questionnaire. And most companies have a questionnaire they can go through. A lot of times the initial rollout of a client, you can have some information, but it's that little bit of information of, I'll never forget years ago, had a client, they were bringing their full containers into Memphis and then turning it around and sending 2/3 of that container back to LA for distribution on the West Coast. Why don't you strip it there and then run a,
I was just going to say, your backhauling is like, why would you do that? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. But nobody had ever talked to them about what their supply chain holistically looked like, So it's key. And I know a lot of great MBOs out there, a lot of awesome customs brokers, and it's communication. It's understanding and taking the time. And most of them won't, all of them want to do a great job, of course, but it's just don't assume. Don't assume.
All right. Well, with that said, I would tell you that we need to wrap up. And in looking at it, folks, this is one of those things. Communicate, look at your transportation, challenges, I guess, holistically, your routes, your carriers, all the different elements that you're in there, your demurrage charges, your process on trying to submit entries early or, trying to eliminate exceptions and all that comes into play. And you start with getting yourself proficient on the knowledge and the skills in dealing with this. So, Melzie, thank you so much. I always love talking with you. You're always so fantastic. All right.
Thank you.
Well, with that, folks, we're going to turn it back over to you. We hope you have a great day. Thank you for your listenership, and please hit that subscribe button. We are approaching new levels in our show, and we need more and more people you're listening to us, but please hit that follow or subscribe button, depending on what service you use. With that, Melzie, thank you, and everybody have a great day.
Thank you very much for joining us. Simply Trade is brought to you by the generous contributions of Global Training Center. You can follow the show and GTC on LinkedIn or Twitter and other social networks. Make sure you check out the show notes in the description for a full rundown of today's show with all the important links. Also, make sure that you share this with a friend and subscribe on your favorite streaming platform. We really like hearing from you. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to rate and review wherever you listen to this podcast. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest on the show or would like to sponsor Simply Trade or suggest any topic you would like for us to discuss, please contact us via email at simplytrade@globaltrainingcenter.com or you can DM us on Twitter at simplytradepod. Thank you again for the privilege of your time. Happy trading. Simply Trade is not a law firm or an advisor. The topics and discussions conducted by Simply Trade hosts and guests should not be considered and is not intended to substitute legal advice. You should seek appropriate counsel for your own situations. These conversations and information are directed towards listeners in the United States for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only and should not be substituted for legal advice. No listener or viewer of this podcast should act or refrain from acting on the basis of information on this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel. Information on this podcast may not be up to date depending on the time of publishing and the time of viewership. The content of this posting is provided as is. No representations are made that the content is error-free. The views expressed in or through this podcast are those of the individual speakers, not those of their respective employers or Global Training Center as a whole. All liability with respect to actions taken or not taken based on the contents of this podcast are hereby expressly disclaimed.